Well, thanks for joining me for the inaugural episode of the Story Crafters Cafe. I am Hank Garner, your host, and today I am welcoming a dear friend of mine, Steve Beaulieu, who is an amazing writer in his own regard. He writes under the pen name of Jaime Castle, and we're going to talk about some of the things that he's written today. But he's also the co-owner of Aethon Books, one of the most interesting small press publishers that I know of in publishing today. They specialize in fantasy and sci-fi and empowering authors to authors that may be publishing in the indie space, but need some help. And they have found a really unique way to help people get their stories out to the world. And I really wanted to highlight them today. Welcome to the
Thank
show,
you.
Steve.
Thanks, Hank. It's
Yeah.
great
So,
to be
Steve,
back with you.
um, if well, I'm glad you joined me today. I've been thinking of the other podcast I do, Author Stories. We always begin with the same question, and it's a great way to kind of kick off um, uh, to get people feeling the warm fuzzies about their
Hmm.
writing life. So I've been thinking of a way to kick this off. And what is one piece of writing advice that you have received, good or bad, that has stuck with you? Maybe someone gave you something that was very motivational, or maybe someone gave you horrible advice that you think back on. Can you point to anything like that?
I could point to 100 things like that. First, let me
Of
say this:
course.
it's really nice to do this video, right? Because we've
Yeah.
done author stories audio for so long, you and I. It's nice to be face to face and talk. As far as the question goes, I literally could give you 100 answers. But let me start with the best advice I've ever received, and that was if you're writing a book, the best way to write a book is to write a book. And I know that that sounds so absurd, but I spent maybe 20 years of my life trying to write a book. And I think that we're gonna, with this podcast, you're gonna reach people that have done it a million times and people who have been trying a million times to do
Yeah.
it. And I had manuscript after manuscript after manuscript that were, some of them were 90,000 words long, and I couldn't even see the end of that because I'm a pantser by nature. So like I didn't know where I was going, I didn't know the direction, and the story just kept doing things. But when I finally finished my first book, which was in just 2017, and since then I've written 17 books, and I have another 13 that I'm currently writing. Um, the best advice at the time was, in order to finish writing a book, you've got to continually write that book. I would write and stop and drop and start something else, and I just get excited about new projects. And when rubber hits the road, authoring is a job that requires the commitment and the intentionality that I think any other job has. And so since then, I've realized, okay, if I start writing a book, this book needs to get finished. And so I've even got books that I wrote that I've never published and I may never publish, or that I just haven't found the right direction to publish those books. But if I start a project, the project gets finished. And along with that, the advice of understanding word count goals is vital. And this is something that we share across the board with all of our authors. If you're going to write a book, you have to have an intentional goal in mind. And so for me, because we run Aethon, because Rhett and I run Aethon, my goal count has reduced drastically. But, I used to have a 2,000 word a day goal. And if I didn't achieve that goal, I didn't go to bed that night. I wrote until I achieved that goal. And for me personally, um, my goal was not just to write 2,000 words. My goal was to write 2,000 good words.
Mm,
And I know a lot of authors who, can throw down 10,000 words a day. But when it comes to the editing process, which, you know, as authors, we're sort of supposed to edit ourselves too.
sure.
When it comes to the editing process, you could take out 40% of those words and they don't matter anymore. Um, and I see that on a constant basis. So best advice, to write a book, you need to write a book. And to write a book, you have to have a goal and achieve those goals no matter what. Worst advice, um, I can't pick out the worst advice. There's so much bad advice going
There's
around,
so much bad
and it
advice.
changes year to year depending on how the marketing or how the publishing industry is going. You know, it used to be if you had a 150,000 word book, split it into two books. Now it's, you know, write as many words in a book as you possibly can to get the Kindle Unlimited money and yada, yada, yada.
Right.
Really, write a good book.
Yeah.
Just write a good book. And if you don't know how to market it, then find a publisher that knows how to market it.
Yeah. So speaking of being a pantser, and editing your work as you go, um, some of the advice that you hear a lot is to turn off your internal editor and get as many um, as as rough a first draft as possible done, and then go back and edit yourself. Does do you think that being a pantser has anything to do with your need to self edit and to clean up your draft as you go? Do those things does one inform the other at all?
I think it's tough for me to answer because I was an editor before I was an author, right? So, you know, I would never suggest to anyone else to be their own final editor, but I'm my own final editor. I do often have proofreaders that will check it for different things, but um, for me, my first draft, the goal for my first draft is always that I could hit publish and not be concerned with the fact that I hit publish. I do often go through the manuscript when I'm done, but it doesn't necessarily, it usually doesn't result in fewer words. It results in potentially more words. Um, and that I think is an answer, a direct answer to your question, right? Because as a pantser, as you're writing, you tend to sort of vomit draft. Um, I personally just vomit draft in such a way where I don't over talk. I sort of under talk. Um, you know, I might come to a section in the book where it's very dialogue heavy, and at the end of the first draft, it's literally just person talking back to person in a white room.
Right.
And then as I go back through it, I realize, oh, well, people need to understand where they are, sort of what they're doing. I don't believe in a lot of stage direction. I don't, you know, there's some advice out here. I'll give you this as a piece of really what I think is really bad advice, and that is avoid dialogue tags. I think dialogue tags are vital to the story and the reader understanding who's speaking. And I think that when authors forego dialogue tag for action,
Hmm.
right? Like, hey man, how are you doing? He picked up his cup of coffee and drank, right? Like, sure, now I know who Hank picked up his cup of
Yeah.
coffee and drank, right? That's fine. I now know that Hank's the one talking, but hey man, how's it going? Hank said, picking up his cup of coffee, achieves the same thing without making the reader have to work for understanding who wrote it. And we see this all the time where we'll have like a full page of dialogue, and you know, maybe there's a dialogue tag every six things, but then the reader has to keep track of the back and forth. And oftentimes you've got more than one person speaking, or more than two people speaking in a section, and it's like it gets overwhelming. And then with the advent of, I say advent, I mean it's been around for 40 years, but like with audiobooks becoming so popular, authors tend to think fewer dialogue tags is what's necessary. But I mean, I'm way bigger in audio. I've sold hundreds and hundreds of thousands of audiobooks, and I don't change that at all because the reader, the narrator, is so used to, he's talking like this is part of it, he said. He's talking like this is part of it, he said, right? They're so used to dropping that tone into he said that it
Right.
doesn't affect anything, and the reader can still follow everything that's going on. So we shifted there back to the first question, but like,
No, that's fine. That's fine. As someone who began as an editor and then um, became a writer, or got the confidence to write, or however you want to look at it, um, I've known some editors that are editors, and you know, uh you ask, what do you think, you have a novel in you? And they're like, oh no, I'm perfectly content to just be an editor. um what was your feeling about that when you were just an editor? And I don't mean just an
No,
editor
I
like
understand
that's,
that. Yeah.
you know what I mean. um what was it that gave you the confidence, or whatever it was that had you take that next step and write your own story?
Well, for a long time, I was really solely editing Rhett C. Bruno's stuff, who's my writing partner. And over the course of time, I realized that I was sort of actually just co-writing his books with him, right? Because one of the reasons I don't edit anymore is because I over edit. The only times that I edit, and I say over edit, I don't think it's over editing. Um, but there tends to be pages and pages of red. Um, because and I think that's the answer, right? When you get to a point where you're reading somebody else's book and all you want to do is actually write into this book and help process what the author's intention is, you probably should be writing instead of editing. I'll still do editing jobs for Aethon when an author comes to us, and specifically if they're a really popular author in one area and they really need help. um, I don't know how to word it, but like I'll take on the really heavy editing projects where I know that they're not going to be upset if I just wrote another chapter for them.
It's like developmental editing on
It's
steroids.
developmental editing, only I'm not good enough at it, honestly, to type in a comment, this is what you need to do. I just do it.
Yeah.
And so some authors are okay with that. Most are not okay with that. As a matter of fact, in the publishing industry, one of the biggest stigmas is that if you have an editor, they're going to change your voice. Um, First of all, let me just say, from a publisher standpoint, we published 700 books. I don't think a single one of our authors would ever say we changed their voice. A bad editor changes your voice, which I would argue makes me a bad editor, because I never, um, by writing into something, your voice automatically becomes part of it. And so most editors are not interested in rewriting your book. They're going to take what you've written and they're going to make it better by changing the word flow in a sentence. And, typically if our authors have a style that we realize that's not my style, but it works, right? Like there's a lot of times when a sentence structure works really well, but there's also another way to do it.
Right.
And so like a sort of bad editor, if I could say it that way, will change it just because they think that that's the way it should be. A good editor will go, no, this is his voice, her voice, we'll keep it as it is. It's not my preference, but this is how they write.
In 2007, when you began writing, um
17.
17, I
Yeah,
meant to say, I'm sorry.
yeah.
um I mean, that's 5 years ago, Steve.
I mean,
And
I technically started writing late 90s, right? Like
yeah,
1999 I started writing books. And then I was a pastor for years, so like all of my writing was nonfiction. So I still continued writing for years and years and years, but like 2017 was the first time I finished a full fiction novel.
that was kind of my story too, is that I had done lots of nonfiction writing for years. And I think building those muscles, none of that writing time is wasted.
Right.
All of that goes to, your writer fitness, if you will. But in 2017, 5 years ago, the Kindle revolution had happened. It had come changed the reading and publishing landscape, um, irrevocably. We're never going back to before the Kindle or digital readers.
Right.
Because there's several in the space, but you know, let's be honest, Kindle is the 800-pound gorilla.
Yeah.
Um, how has publishing, because not only are you a writer, you're a publisher as well. How have things changed in that 5 intervening years since you started writing? A lot has continued to change, and you alluded to um, audiobooks. Audiobooks have been around forever, but there has been a sea change in the last few years, 3 or 4 maybe, where it just seems like well, we know for a fact that is the fastest growth track in publishing, but what else has changed? And if you don't mind, why have audiobooks just skyrocketed the last few years?
Well, excuse me. I could probably point to a bunch of micro changes over the course of the 5 years, but on a wide top-down view, not much has changed. Everyone, people keep trying to sort of reinvent the wheel, and you've got several different markets, right? Like Walmart bought Kobo at one point,
Right.
and Barnes and Noble's tried to do all the things that they've tried to do with Nook, but like you said, Amazon is the 800-pound gorilla, and one of my favorite things to talk to people or to kind of zero in on is that, especially in our industry, we're sci-fi people, right? Like we're fantasy and sci-fi people. In the sci-fi industry, writers typically take their big bad villain or their overarching controller is always this business, this company who has taken over the world. And the reality is that has happened. And there's a lot of people trying to fight it based on fear, based on whatever, diversifying their profiles, all of those things. But Aethon really accepts the fact that Amazon is currently the only way to go. We don't bother with wide. I think that there's probably some listeners that love wide and have excelled on wide. And, I tend to think one of two ways. First of all, it's either a genre that we're not involved in, which there are genres that are very acceptable on wide. You've got romance and thriller, and there's a lot of
Yeah.
readers outside of. But as far as fantasy and sci-fi, it's a death sentence to do anything other than Amazon, because the sci-fi community, fantasy community, are Kindle Unlimited readers, and we make more money on Kindle Unlimited than we make with book sales. The book sales are used as a mechanism to get the book in front of KU readers, because we know that that's where the real income comes from, and that's where the real fan base is for this genre. So what has changed? A lot has changed. People are trying to go direct to sales, right? Selling their books from their websites. To me, that adds another element, an extra element of marketing that we personally don't understand at this point. There are authors that can successfully do it because they've built a fan base, but I tend to look at it and go, okay, where's the new fan base going to come from?
Right.
Amazon organically delivers new readers, and there's new readers hourly, right? Like people who have never picked up a book in their life that go, this Kindle thing is kind of cool. Or they have it on their phone and they go, I've never read a book. Let me read a book. And Amazon targets those people. As a publisher, we don't sell to humans. We sell to machines that sell to humans. And we count on
And
their algorithms and understanding their algorithms in order to get people who we want reading our books to read our books. Audio, I'm an audio junkie. I listen to about
yeah,
200 books a year. And
same.
as far as
I
author,
couldn't do what I do if it weren't for audiobooks.
100% no.
There's no way I could keep up with everything I need to keep up with.
And there's the argument, is audio listening really reading? And I don't give a crap. You're
Yeah.
digesting the material.
Right.
And there was a point in time where written word wasn't the way that you digested stories. It was somebody sitting around a campfire or around the
Right.
hearth or at the dinner table, whatever it was, right? And it didn't change the fact that you were digesting a story. um, and so audio, I think, has grown so much because our lives have become so chaotic in this modern age. And what's interesting, and I think we could talk about this in a different podcast even, right, or a
Yeah.
different conversation that had nothing to do with writing. uh, Technology has not made us less busy, it's made us more busy.
Right.
And because we're more busy, people are traveling to and fro and doing their thing, and it's easy. You could just listen to a book while you do it.
Yeah.
I listen to a book while I mow my lawn, while I clean the kitchen, while I go shopping, while I drive here, while I do, I mean, literally, I'm just always listening to books. And as a writer, beautiful advice, if you're a writer, you need to be a reader. You have to, like,
Yeah.
I can always tell when I get a manuscript from a writer who's not a reader, because they don't know what a book looks like. You might tell a great
Yeah.
story, but you have an entire page of text with no paragraphs. And you have
Right.
dialogue buried inside of a paragraph where people are going to read right over it and not even realize it's dialogue.
Yeah.
Um, so you have to, even as a listener, you have to also read a book every now and then so that you understand how to structure a book.
Right.
Because readers know what a book is structured like, and as soon as they see a wall of text, they're out. You can't comprehend a wall of text.
Right. Yeah. Looking at a page and seeing there's almost an art to seeing how the text breaks down. And without reading a word on it, you can look at the page and you can sense something about the what the author's trying to tell you
Yeah,
in a weird way. And I know that sounds woo woo and all this, but there is something that gets brought across just in the
right.
way that it looks and feels. Um, you're publishing and uh you mentioned Rhett Bruno, who is your writing partner, but also your partner in Aethon. Um, at one point, you realized that some things that you had learned in writing and publishing might be helpful to other people as well. Tell me the story of Aethon and why you decided uh, to help other people, um, to do the things that you had begun to crack the code on.
In 2017, um, there were other people involved in this, but I'm going to leave names out for sake of clarity
Yeah,
and conciseness. Um, Rhett, I was introduced to Rhett by somebody that we knew, and he needed a or he needed a logo for a project called Sci-Fi Bridge, which is a
yeah,
newsletter, right, that blasts emails, and it's a free newsletter, typical to um, something like BookBub, but we do it for free. And he needed a logo, and somebody knew I made logos, so he contacted me, and he and I started talking. And at one point, um, we got to know each other, and he realized that my personality is a personality that's never really serious. I make a lot of jokes and I goof around a lot. And he said, "Hey, I have this project. I really want to write it, but I don't have the funny bone to do it. It needs to be lighthearted and sort of um, pulpy and fun. And would you be interested in working on it with me?" And that was a project called the Luna Missile Crisis, which was actually the very first thing Rhett and I ever wrote together. But it wasn't the first thing we published together, which,
fantastic book,
if
by
we're
the way.
talking about author advice, don't
Yeah,
publish a book the moment it comes out. Or I'm sorry, the moment it comes out of you, the moment that you write
yeah,
it. Get a plan, and we didn't have a plan for Luna because Luna was a standalone novel in a world where standalone does not work. Its series is what sells, and so we needed the exact process to make that work. And what ended up happening was we got a deal with Audible Originals. They did the whole thing with Audible Originals and Ray Porter, and it was only audio for a year. Then we released the ebook, and now we've got film and TV stuff going on with that we can't really talk about. But when you wait, doors open in ways that they might not if you just force something out. So after we were done with that, we had really just discussed that was sort of it. We weren't planning on writing more together, but I started writing this fantasy project, and once again, it had no direction. I hadn't yet learned. I had already gotten the advice on how to write a book and what to do, but I didn't. I wasn't getting it there. It wasn't processing in my mind yet. It was sort of still percolating. And so I started writing this fantasy project, and I kept bugging Rhett. I'm like, "Hey, would you read this? Would you developmental edit it for me? Would you help me figure out what direction to go?" And he was, "No, I don't want to do that. No, I don't." He was a sci-fi only kind of guy, and "I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that." And finally, I broke him down, and he read it, and he liked. It was only like 25,000 words. This wasn't like a lot, but he really liked the idea and the characters that I was working with. But it didn't have the story. And Red is a story master,
yeah.
master of story. I don't know anyone who knows story better than him. Um, so he came back to me. He goes, "Listen, your writing is great. But it's not going anywhere that you want it to go." And I said, "Then write it with me." And he said, "No." And then for 3 or 4 more weeks, I'm like, "You're writing this with me, right?" So then, anyway, that turned into a 6 book, million-word, 100-hour long audiobook series called The Buried Goddess Saga. And that was the start of, we got this, what at the time was an audio advance deal that was more money than I had seen. I was a pastor, right? Like I made more money on that audio advance than I made in a whole year working as a pastor. And so we we ended up doing that project together, self-publishing the ebook, and it did very well. And uh, we began the talks of, if we know how to do this for ourselves. And Rhett had gone through, without telling his story, Rhett had gone through a deal with Random House where he had a series called The Children of Titan, which was Titanborn book one. And then they, the way the traditional publishing industry works is different from us. We sign 3 books at a time and we won't sign less. The traditional publishing industry will sign a book and see how it does before they
Right.
even commission a second book. And so Rhett ended up sort of getting dragged through the weeds on that. And end of the story is that he bought the rights back, relaunched it himself, probably sold more copies of it in one day than Random House did in the 3 years that they had it. So we just started talking, hey, if we know how to do this for us, why couldn't we do this for other people? And Rhett had had a dream long before I did to own a publishing company. Um, but at the time, I was a full-time pastor. He was a full-time architect. It wasn't really something that we thought we could do. Fast forward to summer of 2018, I surprisingly, out of nowhere, got let go from my job at the church. Um, Catastrophic, heartbreaking, confusing thing that happened in my life. This was in August, and it happened on a Saturday. And on Sunday, I told Rhett, I'm like, I don't even know what I'm going to do now. And I started a church immediately. And I really felt like God was saying, this isn't what you're supposed to do. And some of you may not understand that concept, but I heard God say, this is not what you're supposed to do. And I shut down that whole thing. And I said, Rhett, what are we doing? And he said, I'll quit my job and we'll start Aethon. And literally a week later, Rhett quit his full-time job. We lived off of the advance that we got from the Buried Goddess Saga. And 4 months later, we had our first Aethon release, which was a book called Make Me No Grave by Haley Stone, which was, first of all, one of the best books I've ever read in my life.
Fantastic book.
Secondly, it was a huge risk because, Rhett knew her from Random House. She was also a Random House author, and things didn't go quite the way she wanted to either. And nobody wanted Make Me No Grave because it was a weird Western that wasn't weird enough. So they wanted the fantasy elements removed. But then other people wanted more of the fantasy elements because it sat somewhere in a really, this is just a Western with this really small thing that also happens.
Right.
Um, Rhett and I decided to publish it knowing that weird Westerns are a difficult sell. Meanwhile, my biggest project ever was a weird Western, and I'm sure we could talk about that now or later. But Haley Stone's book blew up, and especially for a standalone weird Western by a relatively unknown author, by a completely unknown publisher, it did phenomenally well. And then we got lucky enough to have our next few releases be tremendously popular authors. One of them was Paul Anthony Jones, who has passed since then. And his series, This Alien Earth, did phenomenal things for us. And then Joshua Guyu's Commune series, which was bonkers on audio. He just didn't know how to do it on ebook. We took over the ebook, and that went phenomenally well. So 2019 was a tremendous year for us. We started the whole thing on a $4,000 Kickstarter. And from there, we've built over the course of 3 years to what I could almost factually say is one of the biggest independent sci-fi fantasy publishers that's ever existed.
Excuse me. You guys focus on sci-fi and fantasy, and you understand your market of readers and where they read and how they purchase books. And you mentioned that earlier, that your readers, you know a lot about your readers, and you tailor your business to where you know you are going to sell books. Um, if someone is breaking into writing, and is it important for them to understand what it is they're writing, and how the market may be different for someone that writes sci-fi stories as opposed to someone who writes romance stories, or how decades ago, it might not matter what it is that you are writing. The process was going to be the same. You're going to query an agent, and that agent is going to help you get your book in shape, and then you're going to, submit it to every publisher out there. But those things have changed
Hmm.
as well, and maybe it's due to the Kindle revolution and
Sure.
the audiobooks and all of that. But if someone is trying to break into writing, what would you say to them about narrowing down what it is you're focusing on, because that's going to depend on how you're going to get the book out to the world.
Sure. Let me start by saying that I have an agent. My agent is one of the best in the industry. He represents John Scalzi and Marco Cluse and all those guys. I don't have anything against agents, so let's just foundationally say that. But the age of the gatekeeper
Yeah.
is quickly coming to an end because the internet and the way that we read and write has opened up to a point where authors can now submit to companies like us completely unagented. As a matter of fact, we often prefer it that way, not because it's more beneficial to us, which it is, but also because it's more beneficial to the author. The author retains more of their royalties, they retain more of their control. It's far easier for us to communicate one on one with the author, and we do. We are very hands on with our authors. We consider every author that we have part of our family, and it's just me and Rhett. So our relationship with authors um, are what I hope I could say are deep and meaningful, and so with all of that said, the writing process has changed. What hasn't changed, um, well, I don't even need to say it that way. Let me just say this. When we start to write books as authors, we tend to think of the unique new thing that no one's ever read before, that people are going to be blown away by because it's so unique and new. And first of all, King Solomon said it 6,000 years ago. Nothing new is there's nothing new under the sun, right? Like, and that
Right.
stands today more than ever. There is no such thing as a unique story. There's a unique way of telling a story, but there's really no unique ideas. If it's so unique that you think it like, and I understand that unique is not a word that requires things like so or very. It's but you know what I'm
Right.
saying.
Yeah.
Um, what readers want that readers don't even, I think, know they want is the same story told a different way. We
Mm.
could look at the most popular things in existence. Let's throw Mandalorian out there. It's every Western your dad watched
Yes.
with a guy in a helmet. That's it.
Yeah.
That's all the story is. Um, there's a term in the industry called right to market, which means you're writing not necessarily what you want to write, but what you know the reader wants to read. In romance, I have several romance author friends that write the exact same book over and over again with different characters, different settings. It's the Hallmark Channel
Yeah.
on written word. And how many people do we know that will sit in front of the Hallmark Channel watching the same story over and over again? And there's actually this joyous predictability to it where you know what's going to happen before you happen, and that makes you before it happens, and that makes you feel good that you've sort of predicted that guy's going to get with that girl, but that
Right.
girl actually likes that guy. But then in the end, they're going to like you have that joy of
Yeah.
knowing what's going to happen. In the fantasy and sci-fi markets, it's harder because it's not grounded to the real world. You're inventing everything, and sometimes those inventions can get away from you and start to work against you. Um, it's hard to keep track of your world building, but knowing who you're writing for, which is something that Rhett and I actually we yes, we're a publisher, but one of the things that we actually if I could say pride ourselves in is that we're actually managers. We are author managers. We're here 24/7 to direct you in the best way to tell your story, to sell your books. Although we like to empower our authors to tell their story, we're also going to be the very first one to say that doesn't sell, right? And it's not us going we don't sell that. It's us going, let's look at the Amazon top 100 list over the course of the last several years. It's all the same stuff. It's all the same authors. It's all the same story. It's all the same concept told differently. And that's sometimes upsetting for an author to hear. But at the onset of your writing career, and again, I know I'm talking to people who have done this a million times and people who are, but I'm talking to those who are
Yeah.
starting up. At the onset of your career, you've got to determine what your goal as an author is. We have some authors that don't care if they sell anything, they just want to write a book and have it released. Then there's authors that need this to be a full-time job. And in this society where there's 1.6 billion books a year published on Amazon, um, you've really got to know, to make money, the only way to do that is to write very quickly, or to write a whole bunch of books and then not release them immediately, right? You have to feed the algorithm continually.
Yeah.
A book every month or two for a period of time. I mean, that's just the only way to do it, because people actually don't read authors anymore. They read genres. I once asked somebody, who your favorite author is, and they said, I don't know who any of the authors I read are. And I said, well, what do you read? And they go, I just type in dragon books and fantasy and just read whatever the new dragon books are. So we tend to think if somebody loved our book, that means they're going to read our other books, but they don't even know what our name was.
Right.
Go through reviews in Amazon. How many of them just say the author? They don't even say the author's name. They just said the author did this, 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 and this, because they don't know your name. They never will know your name.
Wow.
It's
That's
weird.
it's weird. It's a little demoralizing. But you know, um, I want to not challenge you, but I want you to clarify something for
Sure.
me. Because if we're writing to market, and that if most readers are looking for a particular book, how does something like Haley Stone's book factor into that? The Weird Western, or your Black Badge series, which is going bonkers right now. You guys have got something amazing going on with this weird Western fantasy, Dresden meets, Tombstone kind of um, thing. How do those things factor into, if we're writing to market and we are paying attention to the tropes that matter to people? How do we introduce these new things that tend to be genre benders and kind of bust open the gates to something new? How does that happen?
Well, our advice to authors is always that mashups don't work the way you think they're going to work. That's a standard. That's a general statement, right? Because there's always the outliers, and Rhett and I are constantly reminding people of the outliers. Dead Acre and the Black Bat series is an outlier. I don't know, when we first wrote that, I had 100 authors come to me with their weird Western ideas, basically saying, now that weird Westerns sell, would you like to publish this weird Western that I wrote? And my answer was no every time. I told them, and then I walked them through the process that was Black Badge. And I'll get to that in a second, but let's touch on Haley Stone for a second. Haley Stone was a shock to us.
Yeah.
It was a surprise. We marketed the hell out of it. Um, Marketing was a big portion of why it sold. First of all, if you look at the cover, you'll notice that it is red with literally the Red Dead Redemption font. And we marketed it to Red Dead Redemption readers, and we
Yeah.
marketed it hard, or players, I mean, hard in that way. And shameful, I don't care. It worked. Um, it worked very, very well. But we still hesitate when somebody comes to us with a weird Western, because for every Make Me No Grave or Black Badge, there's hundreds and hundreds of weird Westerns that have not sold.
Yeah.
When Black Badge book zero, Dead Acre, came out, we have the same narrator, who's Roger Clark, who played Arthur Morgan in Red Dead Redemption 2. He is our narrator. We had another weird Western author who also had Roger Clark, come to us, and they were super excited that now that Dead Acre is selling, that they felt like theirs was going to sell too. That didn't happen. There was no crossover.
Wow.
With Black Badge, I could speak to the plan, right? Because I told you when you finish a book, it doesn't mean you have to release a book. Here was the process for Black Badge. Uh, I had lost my job. I had a garage in my office. It was freezing in there. It was the middle of winter. I had a space heater next to me that barely worked. And I had this idea to write this character named James Crowley. And he was going to be the angel of death reincarnated. Um, there was a backstory that I had about him being Azrael, who actually stabbed Lucifer in the back. And because of that, he was punished to earth, right? There was this huge idea that I had. And I sat down and I wrote 10,000 words about James Crowley entering into this town called Dead Acre. I showed it to Rhett. Rhett's like, the voice is fantastic. This character's exactly what I want to write. But there's no point in writing a weird Western. So let's not do it. This is after Haley Stone. This is after we watched Haley Stone's success. So then we had released Luna Missile Crisis with Audible Originals, and their vice president came to us and said, hey, do you have anything else that you want to sell to us? But we want it to be shorter, somewhere around 30,000 words. And I said, well, we've got this James Crowley thing.
Mm-hmm.
We let him read it, and he goes, I love it, finish it. So Rhett and I were then challenged with taking what I wrote in one day, a 10,000 word day, like I was talking about earlier, that was just
Yeah.
vomit, right? Like it was just, this is a character that would shut up in my head, and I needed to get him on paper. So we threw out almost everything that I wrote. I mean, it was basically just me wanting to write something. And then Rhett and I sat down and we developed the story and we wrote that. So here's point number one. Audible Originals was the plan. That was it, right? Then we're sitting around going, who do we want to narrate this? And I said, man, I wish the dude from Red Dead Redemption narrated books. Rhett hops on Audible. He goes, oh, he does. So we email Audible Studios, hey, can we get Roger Clark for this? Email back, I love that idea. Let me reach out to him and see what we could do. Next day, Roger Clark's in. So we've got Audible Originals, Roger
Dang.
Clark, right? And then I went on deviantart.com and I found artists who did exactly what I was thinking. Now, in my mind, the author, or James Crowley looked like Cullen from Hell on Wheels,
Yeah.
right? That was who I was picturing.
Cullen Bohannon.
Yep. So I was going through all these. I typed in weird Western. That's literally what weird Western in DeviantArt. And I found this guy, Stephen S. Gibson, who had some of the sickest, most amazing weird Western art. I emailed him. I said, what would it cost me to get you to commission a project? He's like, I'm not really doing that. I'm like, I don't care. I need you to do this. So over the course of the next few months, I courted him sort of in the process of, could you please do this for me? I told him all the things we had lined up, and I'm like, it needs your art. So he did the Dead Acre art, and it was like the perfect artwork for this project. Additionally, we made a deal with Audible Studios or Audible Originals that we would forego royalties in exchange for a per word rate where we would never see royalties after that if it goes into what's called Audible Plus, which is free to every member on Audible.
Mm-hmm.
So the plan then just became get as many listeners as humanly possible on this project. We made nothing on that. Listen, I've made more, I don't know, insert thing that you do. I've made more mowing lawns, right? Like than I made on this project. But it garnered somewhere around 5,000 reviews by this point, which means there's over 100,000 listeners to this. And then that led us to a bidding war with several different publishers. Now, remember, I'm a publisher. I didn't feel confident publishing this. Even though it had already gained hundreds of thousands of listeners, I still didn't feel comfortable being the one to publish this. So we had a bidding war with every publisher. Like everyone wanted this, and we ended up going with Blackstone Publishing. They offered us an astronomical amount of money for this project, and we just had them guarantee that we'd use the same artist, we'd use the same narrator, and they're like, why would we do anything but that? So I say that whole story to say this. There was a plan every step of the way to put us in a position to make the most successful 30,000 word story possible. And it worked. It worked because we had all the elements. I don't know if it would have worked if we had 2 out of 3 elements or whatever, but like it was just the perfect setup for this, and we could never relive that. I don't lie to anyone. There's a lot of authors out there who have had what we call sort of viral or lucky success who will make believe they know how to do it. Luck is such a massive thing in the publishing industry. Um, Luck and talent go hand in hand, and sometimes luck trumps talent.
Yeah. Steve, we've seen all of the changes that have happened in publishing over the last decade or so. Um, we I mean, you have lived a lot of these changes and riding the waves of publishing as they've come. There is someone sitting out there today listening to this who is a storyteller, that wants to tell their stories, and they might be hearing all of this from you and just thinking that what's it's daunting now. I don't even know what to do. I want to write a book. I have a book I've been working on, but you know, Amazon's publishing millions of books per year. How to, is my story even going to matter?
Yeah.
What do you say to those people?
Well, we have this like win the lottery kind of like situation where you win the lottery and then everybody you ever knew come out of the woodwork, right?
Right.
Same thing happened to me, right? I People follow me on Facebook, and I start hearing from every person I ever went to high school with, and their wives and their mothers, and literal. I'm like being literal with this. Hey, this my wife has written a book, and she really wants to publish it. Would you look at it? Well, is it sci-fi fantasy? Yeah, it's fantasy. Sure, we'll look at it. And then, of course, one of the next questions is always, well, how much money do you expect that she would be able to make on this? And my answer is $100. I mean, like, I don't know, right? Like, because as a singular thing, writing a book does not make money. You could write a book. I think, Hank, you've written standalone books that you put out there. Nobody's cashing checks. This is not like we're not hand over fist making money with our one book. And so I have to explain that this process looks like a job. If you want to
Yeah.
make money doing this, you're going to have to write 3 books, release 3 books, and be ready to release your next 3 books within the next 6 months. And they're like, well, it's taken me 5 years to write this book. And my answer, oftentimes, honestly, is then making money writing books is probably not for you.
Yeah.
And then I'll often turn them on to the traditional route. I'm like, if this is how you're going to do this particular thing, then the only option you really have is to find an agent who will query big publishers who will do a 1 book a year kind of a release, and they'll, if it's good enough or if they see some value in you, they'll pump a whole lot of money into it. And hey, maybe you'll be the next Lee Berdugo or whatever her name is, right? Like there's avenues for everyone. But what we do as Aethon Books is we publish science fiction and fantasy series, and we do everything we can to capture the KU reader who reads 2 to 3 books a day. That's not an exaggeration. There's a lot of 2 to 3 book a day readers who, by the time they've read the end of book 3, don't remember what happened at the beginning of book 1. It's a Netflix mentality of binging
Yeah.
that exists today. And so if you're looking for, like, if you want to be the next Jim Butcher, most times that's not going to happen. It's the age of like Stephen King is gone. Um, People forget about the big, like, you asked what changed. The authors have changed. People who were massive authors 5 years ago are non-existent anymore. Why? Because the industry spits you up, it chews you up and spits you out. And I'm not trying to be negative. I really don't. I know this is the inaugural podcast, and my last thing that I want to do is discourage people.
Yeah.
What I am trying to do is encourage people to understand their goals and their visions so that they don't end up discouraged in the future.
Right.
That is honestly the goal of saying things like this. If you want to just write books because you love writing books, just don't expect to make money doing it. And if you do, recognize that you're an outlier and you're the one who uploaded their homemade cover with no editing and made $30,000 in the first month because somehow it picked up algorithm. I've heard those stories. They're replicable. It's like
Yeah.
replicable. Um, Nobody knows how it happened, and we just go, that's awesome, proud of you. But then you got guys like Rick Partlow who had to write 28 books before Drop Trooper came along.
Right. And he's a machine.
He's a machine.
He's a machine. Yes. And
So that's what I tell people. Got to know your goals.
yeah.
And the first question you're asking me is about money. This whole industry is actually probably not for you.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Steve, I'm a massive fan of everything that you do, and Aethon and all of that. If people are just, know nothing about you and want to dig into all the stuff that you're up to, where's the best place to go and get familiar with you as a writer and you as a publisher?
Well, me as a writer, check out jaimecastle.com. It's Jaime castle.com. Of course, you could search me on Amazon and Audible, and I've got about 16 books out that, if you're a fantasy sci-fi reader, there's something there I think that you'll enjoy, from superhero to epic fantasy to sci-fi to weird western. There's just, I do what I tell every author we have not to do, and that is to jump genres. But thankfully, I have Aethon, which allows me to do things that I don't think other people should do.
Yeah.
If you are interested in the publishing company, aethonbooks.com, Aethon books.com. And if you're an author who's interested in submitting, there is a submission guidelines on there. If you put, I don't know, Hank Garner, I don't know, put Hank Garner in the subject line, or put dabble writer in the subject line, just something to let our team know that this isn't just a regular submission. We'll pop it up to the front of the pile, and make sure that it gets read, and see if you got something that's going to work for us.
Excellent. Steve, thank you so much for being my guest on this inaugural episode. And we'll put links in the show notes of this so that everyone can find you. Thank you, brother. I
Yeah,
appreciate it.
thank you for having me.